What's going on, guys? Aarava here, and welcome back to my Let's Talk F1 2017 series. This one for the Mercedes W08 F1 2017 Challenger, of course, from the reigning world champions. And what a machine they have built. Such a detailed car, such a complex car in terms of some of the new aerodynamic areas that can be exploited with the 2017 regulation. And obviously, as usual, it's got that Mercedes look. You can't really go wrong with the Mercedes sort of silver and turquoise sort of look. They've had the same sort of scheme for the last kind of 4 years, and you can't really ever get that wrong in a sense. So a very good looking car, especially from this one shot that I'll hopefully have on screen right now at the moment as I'm talking about it. Exquisite shot from the front of the Mercedes car. It's just got like the perfect angle for that photo to make that car look mean. There are some certain other angles that don't make it look as amazing as it is from that front angle. Like from the side on, when you've got it diagonally facing, the car looks very weird and stretched. But from that front-on shot, the kind of lower profile of the car looks absolutely exquisite. But let's get more to the actual details of the car. I'm going to go straight to the most complex and the most interesting part, which is the side area, the bargeboard area, that extended area that teams can now exploit. And oh my days, they have done some work on that car. I don't know if you can see it in this picture, but certainly once I draw all the lines over it, you can definitely then see how many different elements you've got. You've got 3 uprights coming off, starting with obviously the main upright that most F1 teams usually have, which is where the A and the S are for Patronus there on the Mercedes car. That's pretty standard from most F1 teams. We saw Force India have a halfway one, Renault had the dog leg shaped one, but then Mercedes have gone and slapped 2 other uprights extending past, and that floor extension and those 2 uprights can only be there because of the new regulations, because the teams can now exploit that entire area. There's a virtual box they can exploit, and finally they can extend the floor that much more forward to have those 2 uprights there, and they're kind of conjoined together by this tiny little metal kind of thin strip that kind of attaches both of them together, obviously just to try and help the rigidity of those areas. But you have 3 different sections, and you can see, you can't see it from this angle, but if I show you a top-down angle, you can see the different uprights as you go along from the first one with the A and S on it to the last one. You can see they slightly go outboard and outward and wide to the very edge of the area where the FI regulations say the car can be maximum this wide. So they extend out forward. So what they'll be trying to do here is trying to exploit as much air as they can, wider and wider, to the away from the side pod, essentially, because imagine if you didn't have those uprights. You have all this air that's potentially a little bit turbulent coming off the tires, coming off the front wing, going down from the free stream, and if it's not getting affected by anything, it's just going to remain in that same sort of, semi-turbulent sort of wake pattern from the tire and from the front end. So if you have these uprights, they can actually do something about it and try and smoothen out the flow, because you're basically having these vortex generator uprights that's going to encourage mixing the flow. So as it gets towards that rear end, which is a very, very awesome looking and very tight-ended Mercedes rear end, you're smoothing that flow out by having these extra uprights there. You're energizing the flow, so it gets a lot smoother as it goes towards that back end. The smoother you can get that air, the better it's going to work efficiently at that rear end, especially when it meets the little details on the floor and obviously then heads towards the diffuser, which is the kind of big area all the teams are trying to get the air to. But 2 really nice upright detailings, and that's purely there from the actual rulings that the teams can now work with, extending that. And then ahead of that, you've got the actual barge board itself. Now I'm going to pause that on the barge board because I want to take you to something more interesting, which is just above it is an entire black winglet coming off the Mercedes car, which I find very, very awesome, because it's sort of reminiscent of like the old days of, pre-09, 08, 07, when you had all these winglets coming off the cars and they look like a rocket ship. And now, because they can exploit that area, and there's no ruling that says the winglets all have to attach to one another and still be part of the bargeboard structure. So Mercedes have just stuck a winglet there, shaped it very nicely. So with this winglet, they'll directly affect flow going in that area. Obviously, that area, if the winglet wasn't there, that air would just pretty much go and hit the side pod, going through the intake, and then maybe be forced sideways to the side of the side pod just by the fact that there's a wall there, so the air will have to go somewhere. But that winglet now will allow them to not only maybe channel more air directly into the inlet, but also they might be able to get some air above the side, more air going above the side pod to where the vortex generator is and where the upright goes across the top face of the side pod, so they'll be able to get more smoothing air through there, which is it's already smoothened up by that wing. It'll be smoothened up even more by the vortex generator and the upright that's going across that meets where basically the driver actually sits in the car. And then you move down to the Bargeboard. Bargeboard is almost like an evolution of what they've had before. We saw last year in 2016 they had the dagger concept and just a lot of slot gaps in the Bargeboard itself. Now they've extended it out, obviously, naturally, as they would, as the Bargeboard area can increase. And they've serrated the edges on the bottom half. And on the top half, you can't actually see it. You might be able to see it in some different angles if I show it on screen at the moment. But they've got a bit of a bend to the actual top of the Bargeboard as well. So it's not just flat on straight. They've bent it in a way where it's going to encourage the flow to actually curve more, as that's the whole point of the Bargeboard, to actually move the air to the side, to work the air basically as a flow control device. And then they've also got a double element because they've got a smaller, tinier kind of mini Bargeboard wing, I would say, at the very forefront as well. And so that'll mean any air on that particular streamline of air will get affected by that winglet. You know, you'll have different streamlines going across from the left, right, and they go across from left to right. And so that particular streamline will be affected by that winglet, and then you've got the different streamlines on the right of it. They're going to get affected by the main Bargeboard. So a very awesome, complex area for the car. Also, the natural kind of floor complexity as well. They've got a few little divots and slot gaps in the floor. Those were there originally. I mean, Mercedes have had very intricate looking floors. Ever since like last year, 2015, they've always liked to play around with the elevation of the edge of the floor, curling it upwards on itself. And then if we go back to the other angle, which I was first trying to show you guys the actual curving of the top of the Bargeboard, then if we move to the right-hand side of that picture, you'll see, one, the slot that actually allows the air to go into Mercedes' S-duct. Obviously, Mercedes are running an S-duct again this year. It looks very, very nice from the top down, I must say, just from an aesthetic standpoint. But that's where the entry point will be for the S-duct there. Just a small little, it's quite hard to see actually with some shade, with the shading, but I brightened up the picture, able to spot it out there quite easily. And then you've got underneath that I've noted, just underneath the camera housing, the winglets that are there for most F1 cars, but the actual complexity of Mercedes ones is really something to behold. Really nice detailing. You've got six, I think that is, six different little slots in the actual winglet. Again, just trying to manipulate the flow very delicately, very intricately, very detailed. You know, many calculations would have gone in to try and get that at the right, perfect kind of, spacing, angles they want. To just start manipulating the flow, trying to smoothen it out as it gets down towards that Bargeboard. And, that's literally the entire point of this entire area of the car. They're trying to get this air that's going to spiral out in a vortex from the front wing. They're trying to use all these flow control devices to move the airway they want it to, also at the same time energize the flow where they can to get it attached to when it meets the side pod face, because if the air stays attached as much as possible to the side pod faces on the side and the actual top face of the side pod, that's going to mean a much more efficiently working car, especially when the air reaches the back end when it meets the diffuser area. And if you just move on from a top-facing down shot, you can see a lot more intricately that actual winglet. That it's actually quite a hefty, big winglet that they've actually added above that side pod. So very, very nice use of the regulations, interpretation of the regulations. And then there you can see just on the right is the actual S-duct. The air just simply gets injected out. I got a question in the Renault video that would they have vortex generators within the S-duct. I wouldn't think so. Really, the S-duct, it does its own job of injecting air. That's the whole point of it, injecting air to encourage mixing on that top face to stay attached. You wouldn't really put vortex generators there because that job is already being done by the simple fact you're injecting fresh air into that area of the car. And then if we move it on to the rear end of the car, you can see a very, very tightly packaged Mercedes car here, like a size 0 like we've seen from the McLaren car, as it was dubbed the size 0 concept. Mercedes, very, very nice, sleek. It's sort of like a double element side pod because they kind of curve it even more harshly than it could have been kind of halfway down the side pod. And the leading edge side of the side pod, the right hand side, that's kind of meeting more of the maximum regulation. Obviously the regs allow for a certain width of the car, so the side pod in the first half is extending to nearly meet that width, but then obviously what they want is a really tight second half, so they sort of double elemented the side pod by having this small little kink, and then it really tapers in very, very nicely towards that diffuser. And then you can see on the actual flooring itself, slot gaps, multiple ones. I think I can count about 7 or 8 slot gaps there to squirt air into that region between the tyre and the rear wheel. And you've got also a little winglet floor and a little other squirt divot that does the same job. Moving to the rear of the car, the rear wing of the Mercedes is kind of interesting actually, because it's not a fully flat main plane on the bottom flap. They've got a tiny little curve, and if you remember back to races like Spa, teams usually like to make a U-shape with their rear wing. That's to cut drag. So Mercedes' natural default wing structure looks to be just a tiny bit curved, just to cut the drag a tiny bit. Obviously, if we go to Spa later on in the year, we may see definitely that go into more of a aggressive U-shape to really cut the drag of the rear wing. But they've got the usual detailing that they've had from last year, that open-ended slot gap array at the very top that was introduced first by Toro Rosso, and then they've got a streaking slot gap at the very leading edge of the end plate there that'll take air downwards towards the diffuser, and then you've got upwash streaks on the very trailing edge right next to the Epson sign, and that'll encourage air to go upwards, and that's going to create a net downforce on the entire rear end. Moving even more rearward to the actual back of the car, and you can see the Mercedes diffuser in all its glory, and a lot of detailing also on that gap I talked about between the rear tyre and the end plate. So many little winglets there, and also a very nice curved detailing of the exit of the diffuser, so it's sort of outwashing the diffuser actually at the edges, but you've got that entire section of about 5-6 little different elements, trying to get that entire area as vacuum sealed, getting as much upwash as you can in that area, because that's going to allow the diffuser to work better, because you're getting air away from the diffuser on that air in that area of the car where it's usually quite turbulent, obviously straight off coming from the rear tires. You've got all that sidewall air coming off, it's a lot more turbulent. They're trying to get that away as much as possible away from the diffuser to make it work better as a whole for that entire rear section, to plant that rear downward. And final little things to note, the Mercedes has kept its 3 different section airbox intake for the engine cooling as well, and it looks like they've tried to do something a little bit interesting with the actual wing mirrors themselves, tried to curve them a little bit, arc them back to try and just get them a bit more aerodynamically efficient, and the nose is very much almost the same sort of nose they've ran for the majority of 2016. Obviously they introduced that different addition to it in 2016's testing, where they brought the pylons even closer to one another, so it really is like a weird small square space in between, and you can see obviously that's a stark difference to what other teams have gone for. But as I mentioned in the Force India video, that is purely personal preference for each team, what they'll go for, what they want to go for their philosophy. And then obviously the front wing, it's been adapted for the 2017 regulation, that tapered shape, but also you've got the main plane, different flap elements extending back and being angled in a different way to make sure the flow is going where they want it to, towards the barge boards. And you've got little detailings coming off the actual brake ducts as well, 2 little winglets you can see on the right hand side in red that are coming off the brake duct, so any air that would usually just go straight past the brake duct or into the brake duct itself will now get affected by those 2 winglets, and they'll be trying to channel them perhaps to the top of the side pod, maybe also perhaps to those extra uprights they've now got on the side as well. And obviously that same tunneling arching area of the front wing that Mercedes themselves first introduced is still there, trying to get flow to the very front of the tyre and then also to the edge of the tyre to try and clean up that air coming off the tyre weight. But that has been the Mercedes W07. A lot of awesome detailings, especially in that side area. Lovely, lovely side area. That winglet, especially for me personally, is one of the coolest looking things ever from that car. Just a nice chunky winglet coming off that. It's just very reminiscent of what we used to have before 09 when the regulations tried to smoothen up the bodywork there. So very awesome detailing. Let me know what you think about the Mercedes car. What do you guys think of that, about the design? So that's going to be it for today. Let me know what you think about the Mercedes W07, the 2017 Challenger. Also, interestingly enough, no shark fin as of yet. There are some reports that they may be trialing a shark fin later on in testing, and that it definitely will be changing somewhat. The Mercedes car as a whole, we're talking, will definitely be changing throughout testing before it gets to Melbourne, we've been told. So there may definitely be a bigger shark fin. For now, Mercedes have pretty much got this little, I wouldn't call it a shark fin, it's a fin on the engine cover they've had from 2016. They had it in 2015 as well. A lot of other teams you would have seen, if you look at pictures from 2016, have a small little fin going down the entirety of the engine cover and following the engine cover profile, but they've not got an extending out kind of more blockier shark fin as of yet, but they may get introduced later on. Obviously testing only starts literally next week on Monday, so you may see that come into play then. But that's been the Mercedes car. Let me know what you think of the look. If you did enjoy the video, hit that like button. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. And you don't have to, and do subscribe for weekly for more content. I've been over. Have a enjoyed today, and I'll see you guys next time.